Los Angeles, November 1969. Cedars-Sinai Hospital. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the night shift had already settled into its usual rhythm. For nurses on duty, 32 patients asleep, and one girl in room 214 who refused to stop talking about a visitor no one else had seen. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 19 years old, and according to every chart, she wasn't supposed to make it past December. The fluorescent lights in the hallway buzzed softly, flickering every few seconds like they were struggling to stay awake. Outside, a thin rain tapped against the windows, steady and cold. Inside, machines beeped in slow, predictable intervals, heart monitors, oxygen levels, the quiet math of survival. But in room 214, nothing felt predictable. "He comes at the same time," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every night. Around 2. Nurse Margaret Hill didn't even look up from the clipboard. "You said that yesterday," she replied flatly. "And the night before," Elena added. Margaret sighed. She was 34, 8 years into night shifts, and she had heard every version of this before. Patients imagining visitors, voices, shadows. It wasn't cruelty that made her dismiss it. It was repetition. "Your medication can cause vivid dreams," Margaret said, checking the 4-line, "especially at this hour." Elena shook her head slowly. Her dark hair clung to her face, damp from a light fever. "No, he's real." That made Margaret pause, just for half a second, not because of the words, but because of how calmly Elena said them. No panic, no confusion, just certainty. "What does he look like?" Margaret asked, almost out of habit. Elena stared toward the window, where the rain traced thin lines down the glass. "He doesn't talk much," she said, "but when he does, it feels like he already knows everything." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That's not a description." Elena hesitated. Then, quietly, "He smells like smoke and something sweet, and he writes things down. Every time." Margaret finally looked up. "Writes what?" Elena reached slowly under a pillow, but then she stopped. Her hand froze halfway. "He said not to show anyone." Margaret exhaled sharply, almost amused now. "Of course he did." A silence settled between them. Only the monitor filled it, steady, mechanical, indifferent. Beep, beep, beep. "Elena," Margaret said more gently this time, "there's no one coming into this room. I've been on this floor since 10 p.m. No visitors were logged. No doors opened. Nothing." Elena didn't argue. She just looked back at her. "You don't stay awake at 2:17, she said. That landed differently. Margaret checked the time, without thinking. 2:19 a.m. A small, irrational discomfort crept into her chest. "I do my rounds," she replied quickly. "Every hour." Elena gave a faint smile. "Then why do you always miss him?" The question lingered longer than it should have. Margaret closed the clipboard a little harder than necessary. "That's enough for tonight." She adjusted the blanket, checked the monitor again, heart rate slightly elevated but stable, and turned toward the door. But just before she stepped out, "Elena," she said without turning back, "if he comes tonight." A pause. Press the call button. Elena didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than before. "He doesn't like interruptions." Margaret almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she stepped into the hallway, letting the door click shut behind her with a quiet, final sound. By 2:43 a.m., the floor had gone still again. Room 210, sleeping. Room 212, sedated. Room 214. Margaret glanced at the door as she passed. Closed. Quiet. Normal. She kept walking. At 3:06 a.m., one of the monitors down the hall gave a short, sharp spike. Nothing serious, just enough to pull her attention away for a few minutes. By the time she returned to the central desk, the rain outside had grown heavier, tapping louder now against the windows like impatient fingers. Margaret poured herself half a cup of cold coffee and sat down, flipping through patient notes. Routine, predictable, safe. Then she noticed something. Room 214. No call button had been pressed. No alerts. Nothing unusual. And yet, for a brief moment, She was certain she had seen something earlier. Not a person. Not clearly. Just movement. Near the door. She shook her head immediately. Lack of sleep, she muttered. Still, she stood up, walked back down the hallway, each step quieter than the last. When she reached room 214, she didn't go in right away. She listened. Nothing. No voices. No movement. Just the steady rhythm of the monitor. Beep, beep, beep. Margaret slowly pushed the door open. The room looked exactly the same. Dim light. Rain on the window. Elena lying still in bed, eyes closed, sleeping. Margaret exhaled. Of course. She stepped inside just enough to check, and that's when she saw it. On the small table beside Elena's bed, a folded piece of paper. Margaret frowned. She was sure that table had been empty less than an hour ago. Slowly, she stepped closer. The paper was small, torn from a notebook. No hospital markings. No official stamp. Just handwriting. Messy. Quick. Intentional. Margaret reached for it, then stopped. For reasons she couldn't explain, her hand hovered just above the page. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Not fear. Something sharper. Recognition. But that didn't make sense. She had never seen this before. Right? Behind her, Elena's voice broke the silence. Soft. Awake. He came again, she said. Margaret turned slowly. Elena was staring straight at her now. Not confused. Not dreaming. Certain. And then she added, he said you'd finally notice tonight. Somewhere in the city, less than 3 miles away, a crowd of over 200 people was spilling out of a late-night club on the Sunset Strip. Music still ringing in their ears. A name echoing in conversations. Jim Morrison. And back in room 214, Margaret finally picked up the paper. Her fingers tightened slightly as she read the first line. Her expression changed. Not disbelief. Something deeper. Something unsettled. Because the handwriting felt familiar. For the first time that night, Margaret Hill wasn't sure she was alone on this floor. Los Angeles, November 1969. Cedars-Sinai Hospital. At exactly 2:14 a.m. the next night, Margaret Hill stood outside room 214 with her hand resting on the door handle, and this time, she wasn't pretending it was just another routine check. She had counted the minutes, watched the clock tick from 2:09, 2:10, 2:11. No distractions, no rounds, no coffee, just waiting. Inside her pocket was a folded paper she had taken the night before. She had read it 6 times. And each time, the same line unsettled her more. You don't disappear when your body does. Only when no one remembers your voice. No signature. Just the faintest initials at the bottom. JM. At first, it meant nothing. But sometime around 4:30 a.m., after her shift ended, she sat in her car and stared at it again, and a strange thought crossed her mind. Not logical. Not even fully formed. Just a feeling. Like she had seen that rhythm before. That way of writing. Short, heavy, final. She shook it off then. But she hadn't forgotten it. And now, it was 2:14 a.m. again. Margaret slowly pushed the door open. Room 214 was dim, lit only by the hallway glow spilling across the floor. The rain had stopped tonight, replaced by a dry, heavy silence that made every small sound feel louder than it should. Elena was awake, sitting slightly upright. Waiting. You're early, Elena said quietly. Margaret stepped inside. I told you, if someone's coming, I want to see him. Elena didn't argue this time. She just nodded once, then looked toward the corner of the room. Not the door, not the window, the corner. Margaret followed her gaze. Nothing, just shadows. You see, Margaret said, her voice tighter than she intended. There's no one here. Elena didn't respond. She kept looking at that same spot, like she was listening to something Margaret couldn't hear. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. Margaret crossed her arms. This is exactly what I... Don't. Elena whispered suddenly. Margaret stopped. What? He doesn't like when people talk over him. A cold irritation crept in. Elena, there is no... Then why did you bring the paper back? That hit harder than it should have. Margaret's hand instinctively touched her pocket. "You went through my things?" she asked sharply. Elena shook her head. "I didn't have to." Silence. Then a sound. Soft. Barely there. Not from a hallway. Not from the machines. From inside the room. A shift, like fabric moving. Margaret turned quickly. This time, there was someone, standing near the far wall. Still, unmoving. He hadn't been there a second ago. Margaret was sure of it. He was tall, lean, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to blend into the dim light. His hair fell loosely around his face, slightly damp like he had just stepped in from outside. But the strangest thing, he wasn't looking at Margaret. He was looking at Elena, like she was the only person in the room. No introduction, no movement, just presence. Margaret felt her throat tighten. "How did you get in here?" she demanded. No response. The man stepped forward once. Slow, measured. The floor didn't creak. The air didn't shift. But somehow, everything felt different. Elena's breathing softened. "You're late," she said to him. The man tilted his head slightly. 3 minutes, he replied. His voice was low, calm, almost detached. Margaret stepped between them instinctively. "This is a restricted floor," she said. "Visiting hours ended at 9. You need to leave immediately." The man finally looked at her, and for a brief second, Margaret forgot what she was about to say next. There was nothing aggressive in his expression, nothing loud, but his eyes, they were too aware, like he was reading something she hadn't said yet. "You're the one who took the page," he said. Not a question, a statement. Margaret swallowed. "Ah, yes. It was left here without." "It wasn't left," he interrupted softly. A pause. "I gave it." The room felt smaller suddenly. Margaret steadied herself. "You can't just walk into a hospital and leave things with patients. That's not how this works." He almost smiled. "Nothing about this works," he said. Another silence. Elena watched both of them carefully now. Margaret took a step forward. "What's your name?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Black, worn. He flipped it open slowly. "You already saw it," he said. Margaret's pulse quickened. That same feeling again. Recognition. Something just beneath the surface. "I asked your name," she repeated. This time, he looked directly at her and said it. "Jim." The word landed quietly, but it didn't stay quiet, because somewhere in Margaret's memory, a voice, a stage, a name she had heard on the radio just 2 nights ago at 11:40 p.m. Jim Morrison. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she said under her breath. It didn't fit. It couldn't. Not here. Not like this. Elena spoke again, softer now. He said names don't matter here. Jim closed the notebook. Only voices do. Margaret stared at him, trying to place it, trying to prove herself wrong. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. Jim shrugged faintly. "Neither is she." The words hit harder than anything else he'd said. Elena didn't react, like she had already accepted it. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. A line crossed between routine and something she couldn't explain anymore. Jim stepped closer to the bed, not touching, just near enough. "Elena," he said quietly, "did you tell her?" Elena hesitated, then shook her head. "No." Jim nodded once. "Good." Margaret's voice cut in, sharper now. "Tell me what?" Jim didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Elena and said, "She still thinks this is about staying alive." That sentence didn't make sense. Not yet, but something about the way he said it made it feel like it would. Soon, and for the first time, Margaret wasn't questioning if he was real. She was questioning something worse. What if Elena had been telling the truth the entire time? Los Angeles, November 1969. Cedars-Sinai Hospital. At exactly 2:28 a.m., room 214 felt smaller than it should have, like the walls had quietly moved closer, narrowing the space between 3 people who were no longer standing on the same version of reality. Margaret Hill stood near the foot of the bed, her clipboard forgotten on the chair behind her. Elena was watching Jim, and Jim Morrison, if that's who he really was, stood still, one hand resting loosely against the edge of the metal bedrail, his black notebook closed but not put away. She still thinks this is about staying alive. The sentence lingered. Margaret broke first. What does that even mean? She demanded. Jim didn't answer her. He rarely did. Instead, he pulled a chair closer and sat down slowly, the legs scraping faintly against the tile floor. The sound felt louder than it should have. Elena, he said softly, tell her what you told me yesterday. Elena looked down at her hands. For a moment, she seemed younger than 19, smaller. I told you, she began quietly, that I'm not scared of dying. Margaret crossed her arms. That's not unusual for patients in your condition. Elena shook her head. You didn't let me finish. A pause. Then, I'm scared of disappearing. The room went still. Not quiet. Still. Even the monitor seemed to hesitate between beats. Beep, beep. Margaret frowned slightly. People don't just disappear. Jim finally looked at her. They do, he said. Short, certain. Margaret held his gaze. You're talking in circles. Jim tilted his head. You're listening in straight lines. That irritated her more than she expected. Elena has a medical condition, Margaret said firmly. Her heart is failing. That's the reality. Jim nodded once. I know. Then stopped filling her head with. I'm not feeling anything, he cut in, still calm. I'm listening. That landed, because Margaret realized she hadn't really been listening. Not to Elena. Not beyond symptoms and charts and numbers. Elena, Jim said again, softer now, tell her what you hear at night. Elena hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. After 3 a.m., she said slowly, when everything gets quiet, I can hear the other rooms. Margaret exhaled. That's normal. Sound travels differently at night. No, Elena whispered. She looked up now, eyes clearer than they've been all day. I hear them stop. Margaret's expression shifted. What do you mean? Elena swallowed. I count the machines, she said. Every night. There are 32 on this floor. Different rhythms. Different speeds. She pointed weakly toward the hallway. Room 210 slow. Room 212 uneven. Room 217 too fast. Margaret didn't interrupt this time. And then Elena continued. One of them just stops. Silence. No beeping. No warning. Just gone. Margaret felt a chill run through her arms. That happens, she said carefully. Patients pass. It's part of... But no one remembers them. Elena said quickly. That stopped her. Jim watched Margaret now. Carefully. They take the body out. Elena continued, her voice shaking slightly. Change the sheets, bring in someone new, and after a few days... She looked down. No one says their name again. The monitor beeped steadily beside her. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. That's not true, she said. But there was less certainty now. Jim leaned forward slightly. This hospital processes over 200 deaths a year, he said quietly. How many names you remember? Margaret didn't answer, because she couldn't. Not really. Not beyond a few. A very few. Jim leaned back again. That's what she's afraid of, he said. Elena nodded faintly. I don't want to be just a file, she whispered, or a number on a chart. Margaret looked at her. Really looked this time. Not as a patient. As a person. And the notes, she asked slowly. The things he writes you, what are they supposed to do? Elena reached under her pillow again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She pulled out 3 folded pages, carefully worn at the edges. Margaret stepped closer. Jim didn't move. He says, Elena began, unfolding one of them, if someone carries your words, you don't disappear. Margaret took one of the pages. Her hands were steady, but her breath wasn't. The handwriting was the same. Messy, fast, but precise in a way that felt intentional. She read a line aloud without meaning to. They will forget your face in weeks, your voice in days. But the right sentence can survive for decades. Margaret's throat tightened. She looked at Jim. Why are you doing this? This time, he answered immediately. Because no one did it for me. The room shifted again. That was the first real thing he had said about himself. Margaret studied his face more carefully now. The tiredness, the weight behind his eyes. You're not forgotten, she said. You're famous, he finished. A faint, almost humorless smile. That's not the same thing. Silence. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled briefly, then stopped. The world outside continued, but inside this room, something deeper was unfolding. Elena, Jim said softly. How many pages now? She counted quietly. 7. Jim nodded. Good. Margaret frowned. Good for what? Jim stood up slowly. He looked at Elena, then at the pages in Margaret's hand, and said, 8 is enough to outlive a body. Margaret's grip tightened on the paper. What happens at 8? Jim didn't answer immediately. He just slipped the notebook back into his coat, then looked at Elena one more time, and asked, Are you ready to be remembered, or do you still want more time? That question changed everything, because for the first time, this wasn't about survival anymore. It was about choice. And Margaret realized she had no idea what Elena was going to say next. Los Angeles, November 1969. Cedars-Sinai Hospital. At exactly 2:41 a.m., the air inside room 214 felt heavier, like something irreversible had already begun, even before anyone spoke. Jim stood beside the bed. Elena looked at him. Margaret held the pages in her hand, and for a few seconds, no one moved. Are you ready to be remembered, or do you still want more time? The question didn't sound dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it split the moment clean in two. Before and after, Elena's breathing became uneven. The monitor responded instantly. Beep, 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 beep. Margaret stepped forward. Her heart rate is climbing. This needs to stop. Elena lifted her hand weakly. No, it was the strongest she had sounded all night. Margaret froze. I need to answer him, Elena said. Jim didn't interrupt. He didn't rush her. He just watched, like he already knew which way this would go. Elena swallowed slowly, her eyes moving between the pages, the monitor, and finally, Jim, I don't want more time, she said. Margaret's chest tightened instantly. Elena, don't say that. I've had time, Elena continued, her voice shaking but clear. 19 years. That's not nothing. Her fingers curled slightly into the blanket. But I can feel it, she whispered. Every hour now it's getting smaller. The monitor spiked again. Beep, 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 beep. Margaret reached for the call button on the wall. Jim's voice cut through the room. Don't. It wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to stop her. Margaret turned sharply. She's crashing. Jim shook his head once. No, she's choosing. That sentence hit harder than anything else. This isn't a choice. Margaret snapped. This is cardiac failure. Jim stepped closer, not aggressive, not urgent, but certain. You think she's losing something, he said quietly. She's deciding what to keep. Margaret stared at him, then at Elena, then back at the monitor. Numbers rising, time shrinking, reality pressing in from all sides. Elena, Margaret said, softer now, if you stop fighting, there's nothing we can do. Elena looked at her, and for the first time, she smiled, not out of denial, out of clarity. That's okay, she said. Silence. Jim reached into his coat again, pulled out the notebook, flipped to a blank page. The sound of the paper turning felt louder than the monitor now. Then we finish it, he said. Margaret's voice dropped. Finish what? Jim didn't look at her. The 8th page. The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. Elena exhaled slowly. Okay. Margaret stepped back, shaking her head. No, I'm not letting this happen. But she didn't move toward the door. She didn't press the button, because something inside her, something she didn't understand yet, was telling her to stay. Jim placed the notebook on the small table, tore out a clean sheet, smoothed it once with his hand, then looked at Elena. Say it, he said. Elena hesitated, not out of fear, out of precision. I don't know what to say. Jim nodded. Then don't say something big. A pause. Say something true. The monitor steadied slightly. Beep, beep. Elena closed her eyes. Thinking. Not about death. About memory. About what would remain when everything else disappeared. Then, I like the sound of rain on hospital windows, she whispered. Jim wrote. Fast. Clean. No hesitation. And, she added, her voice fading slightly, I didn't feel alone at 217. Jim's pen didn't stop. Margaret watched him now. Really watched. The way his hand moved. The rhythm. And suddenly, that recognition from before came rushing back. Not just familiar. Confirmed. Her voice dropped. I've seen that before. Jim didn't react. Elena continued, weaker now. Tell them I wasn't scared at the end. The monitor dipped, then spiked, then dipped again. Margaret's instincts screamed at her to act, but she couldn't move. Not yet, because something else was happening. Something she had never seen in all her 8 years on night shift. Elena wasn't fading in panic. She was focusing, choosing every word like it mattered more than her pulse. Jim finished writing, tore the page cleanly, folded it once, then placed it gently in Elena's hand. That's enough, he said. The room went still, not quiet, still, even the machine. Beep, beep. Slower now. Margaret stepped forward again, tears forming before she even noticed them. Elena turned her head slightly, looked at her. Will you remember me? She asked. Margaret didn't hesitate this time. Yes. It came out instantly. No doubt, no distance, just truth. Elena nodded faintly. Then it worked. The monitor gave one sharp spike. Beep, and then, flat, a long, continuous sound filled the room. Margaret reacted instantly now, years of training taking over. Code blue, room 214. She reached for Elena. Check pulse. Nothing. No, stay with me. But even as she said it, she knew. Time of death would later be recorded as 2:52 a.m., age 19. Cause heart failure. But that wasn't what Margaret would remember. Not really, because when she looked up, Jim was already stepping back. Not rushing, not reacting, just leaving. Wait! Margaret called out. He paused at the door, didn't turn around. You can't just walk out after this, she said, her voice breaking. Who are you? A short silence. Then, you already know. And he was gone. No sound, no footsteps, just absence. Margaret stood there, breathing hard, the flat line still ringing in her ears. Behind her, Elena's hand rested still on the bed, the folded page still between her fingers. Margaret slowly reached for it, unfolded it. Read the last line Jim had written. Her breath caught, because this wasn't just a note. It was a marker, a decision, a proof. This was the moment everything stopped being a story and became something real. Los Angeles, November 1969. Cedars-Sinai Hospital. At exactly 3:07 a.m., room 214 was no longer a place of uncertainty. It was a closed moment, documented, final. 2 orderlies stood near the door. One doctor, Dr. Harris, age 46, flipped through Elena's chart with quiet efficiency. The monitor had been turned off. The long, continuous tone was gone, replaced by silence. Margaret Hill stood beside the bed, still holding the folded page. She hadn't let go of it, not once. Time of death, 2:52 a.m., Dr. Harris said, writing it down. Notify records. Inform next of kin by morning. Routine, clean, detached. Margaret looked at him. She wasn't alone, she said. Dr. Harris didn't look up. Patients often experience. There was someone here. That made him pause. Finally, he looked at her. Visiting hours ended at 9, he said calmly. Security logs show no entries past 10:12 p.m. Margaret shook her head. Then your logs are wrong. A quiet tension formed in the room. The younger orderly shifted slightly, uncomfortable. Dr. Harris closed the chart. Margaret, he said, lowering his voice. "You've been on 4 consecutive night shifts. You need rest. That's not what this is. It usually is." The dismissal landed, but not the way it used to, because now Margaret had something they didn't. Proof. She slowly unfolded the page again. Her hands were steady now. "Then explain this." Dr. Harris glanced at it briefly, then longer. The handwriting, the phrasing. Something about it didn't feel like a patient's last words. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "He wrote it," Margaret said. "Who?" "A beat." Margaret hesitated, because saying it out loud would make it real. "Jim," she said finally. The room didn't react. No recognition. No shift. Just confusion. Dr. Harris exhaled lightly. "Last name?" Margaret's grip tightened slightly. "Morrison." Silence. Then a faint, almost amused smile from one of the orderlies. "You mean the singer?" he said under his breath. Margaret didn't respond, because suddenly she wasn't as sure as she had been just minutes ago. Not logically. Not in a way she could defend. Dr. Harris handed the paper back. "Keep it with her belongings," he said. "Family might want it." That was it. Conversation over. Reality restored. At least for them. By 3:26 a.m., the room had been cleared. Fresh sheets. Empty bed. Chart removed. Door left slightly open for the next admission. Margaret stayed behind. Alone. The hallway outside had returned to its quiet rhythm. Distant footsteps. A cart rolling. Low voices blending into background noise. But inside, it still felt like something had been left unfinished. Margaret sat down slowly in the same chair Jim had used. She placed a folded page on the table. Next to it, she laid the other 7 notes Elena had kept. All of them together now. 8. Jim had been precise about that. 8 is enough to outlive a body. Margaret stared at them. Then, one by one, she opened each page, reading. Not quickly, carefully. Each sentence felt deliberate, weighted, like it had been written with time running out. Not just for Elena, but for something else. For him. One line stood out immediately. "Fame is loud. Memory is quiet. Only one of them lasts." Margaret leaned back slightly. Her eyes moved to the last page again. The 8th. The one written just minutes before Elena died. She read it silently this time. Then again. Then a third time. Her chest tightened. Because now she understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just about Elena. Jim hadn't come here to save her. He had come here to make sure something survived. Not a life. A voice. A record that couldn't be erased by charts or time or routine. Margaret stood up slowly, walked to the window. The rain had stopped completely now. The glass reflected her faintly. Tired eyes. Still in uniform. Holding something she couldn't explain to anyone else on this floor. Behind her, 8 pages. No signatures beyond 2 letters. No official record. No proof. Except she walked back to the table, picked up the pages again. This time, she didn't put them with Elena's belongings. She folded them carefully and slipped them into her own bag. A decision. Quiet. Irreversible. Because something told her, if she left them here, they would disappear. Just like Elena feared. At 3:41 a.m., Margaret stepped out of room 214 for the last time. She paused in the hallway, looked once toward the exit, half expecting something, a shadow, a figure, him. But there was nothing, just fluorescent lights, empty space, normal. She walked toward the nurse's station, sat down, opened the patient log, and for the first time in her career, she hesitated before writing. Then, slowly, she added one extra line beneath Elena's record. Not required, not standard, not even noticed by anyone else. Just one sentence. Small, quiet, but permanent. Patient was not alone. No one questioned it. No one erased it. It stayed there, unnoticed, for years. And somewhere in Los Angeles, less than 5 miles away, a man walked out of a bar on the Sunset Strip at exactly 4:12 a.m., surrounded by noise, laughter, and flashing lights. Recognized, celebrated, loud, Jim Morrison. But no one in that crowd knew where he had been just an hour earlier. And no one would, for a very long time. Los Angeles, April 1989. Cedars-Sinai Hospital had changed in ways most people wouldn't notice, but Margaret Hill did. She noticed everything. The old wing where room 214 once stood had been partially renovated. New paint, updated monitors, different staff. Even the hallway lights felt brighter. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., something still felt the same. Margaret was 54 years old now. No longer full-time, just occasional night shifts. Enough to stay connected. Enough to remember. She stood at the nurse's station, flipping through archived records she had quietly requested earlier that night. Not for work, for closure. A small tape recorder sat beside her, standard issue for internal interviews. A young hospital administrator, Daniel Reeves, age 29, had asked her to recount unusual experiences from her early years on staff. Most of the stories were routine. Stress, fatigue, misinterpretations. But one file had stayed with her for 20 years. Room 214. Elena Vasquez. Time of death, 2:52 a.m. Margaret opened the folder slowly. The paper had aged. Slight discoloration along the edges. Ink slightly faded, but still readable. And there it was. Her handwriting. One extra line beneath the official report. Patient was not alone. Daniel leaned forward slightly. You actually wrote that? Margaret nodded. I wasn't supposed to. Then why did you? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag, carefully, deliberately, and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside, 8 folded pages. She hadn't shown them to anyone, not once. Until now. Daniel frowned slightly. What is that? Margaret placed them on the desk. Read the last one, she said. He hesitated, then unfolded the 8th page. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slower. Then he stopped. Who wrote this? He asked. Margaret watched him carefully. That's what you're here to find out. Daniel looked down again. The handwriting, the phrasing. There was something oddly familiar about it. I've seen this before, he said quietly. Margaret gave a faint nod. So had I. A long pause filled the space between them. Then Margaret stood up. Come with me. At exactly 2:26 a.m., they stood in front of what used to be room 214. Now it was labeled differently. New number, new purpose, but the space. Margaret could still feel it. This is where it happened, she said. Daniel looked around, trying to see something that wasn't visible. Who was he asked. Margaret exhaled slowly. For years, I told myself it didn't matter, she said. That what happened in that room was about her. A pause. But it wasn't just her. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, folded newspaper clipping, dated July 1971. Headline, Jim Morrison found dead in Paris at age 27. Daniel's expression shifted. He looked back at the pages in his hand, then at Margaret. No, he said quietly. That's not possible. That's what I thought, Margaret replied. She stepped closer, lowered her voice. But 3 weeks after that article came out, I heard one of his old recordings on the radio. Daniel waited. And I froze, she continued, because the way he spoke, the pauses, the rhythm, her voice tightened slightly. It was the same voice. Silence. Heavy. Unavoidable. Daniel looked back at the page again. His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. You're saying Jim Morrison was here? In this hospital? Margaret didn't answer directly. Instead, she pointed to the bottom of the page. 2 initials. J.M. Daniel stared at them, then back at her. That could be anyone. Margaret nodded. It could. A beat. But it wasn't. Another silence. Then, why didn't you come forward? He asked. Margaret gave a small, almost distant smile. Who would believe it? That was the truth. Simple. Final. Back at the nurse's station, Margaret carefully refolded all 8 pages, placed them back into the envelope. But this time, she didn't put them back in her bag. She slid them across the desk, toward Daniel. He looked at her, confused. What are you doing? Margaret met his eyes. The same thing he did. A pause, making sure someone else carries it. Daniel hesitated, then slowly took the envelope, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of it. Margaret stepped back, looked once more down the hallway. The lights, the silence, the same quiet rhythm that had never really changed. At 2:17, she said softly, I still wake up sometimes. Daniel didn't respond. I don't see him, she added. A small pause, but I remember the words. She turned to leave, then stopped, just for a second, and that's enough. Years later, Daniel would describe that night in a recorded interview. He kept the pages. All 8, locked, preserved, not published, not proven, but never dismissed. People think memory is something you hold, he said once. But sometimes it's something that's handed to you. And as for Elena Vasquez, there was no plaque, no record beyond the file, no photograph in the hospital halls. But her words, they survived, passed from one person to another, quietly, exactly the way Jim intended. Because in the end, it was never about how long she lived. It was about what refused to disappear. Some voices don't fade.